Has the new endgame been beating you down? Are you sick and tired of every single team needing highest to sustain? Is your Huan falling off because you run out of skill point every 2 turns? Well, worry not, because with the brand new DHPT, you can now finally have a proper team to sustain for free 99. Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and on today's episode of Early Access Reviews, we are going to be taking a look at our latest free physical preservation sustain. In fact, our first preservation sustain a long time ever since adventuring DHPT, right? So we'll talk about his build, like team conversations, why his role in the endgame, etc. So without further ado, let's get into today's content. So in summary, DHPT is going to be an attack scaling shield sustain that gets a team-wide cleanse via its built-in summon for the designated ally, the Soul Dragon. Note that this is not to be confused with Nemo sprites. They are basically a normal summon like Lightning Lord, Nambi, as well as Fu Yuan, and yes, this in fact does work with the banana set. On top of having an impressive amount of shield you can easily rival Aventurine, he also provides the added utility of the 15% attack buff based on DHPT's attack, as well as an AoE follow-up attack from this ultimate state for 2 hits based on his own and his allies' attack damage. So jumping to the character kit, his basic attack is gonna be used pretty frequently because he's a very skill point positive sustain, very similar to Aventurine. If you're familiar with back in those days when Aventurine first launched, most of the time you are able to keep your entire team alive simply from using his basic attacks, and DHPT is not gonna be an exception. That being said, you can use his skills more frequently for non-skill point heavy DPS such as Aglaya, or if you want to give him a little bit more basic attacks so they can give skill points to Diarra and Nexa, then feel free to do so, right? For his skill, it is going to be a pretty straightforward one, very similar to once again Aventurine. The shield effects from your skill as well as ultimate is the exact same scaling at 20% attack as well as plus 400 to all allies, whereas the Soul Dragon action is going to be 10% plus 200 to all and 5% plus 100 to the one lowest HP ally, right? Now the part that makes this better than the Aventurine shield is that the shield amount stacking cannot exceed 300% of the total skill value compared to Aventurine's 200%. This means that if DHPT has 4000 attack, each skill is going to give you roughly 1200 shield, and the total cannot exceed 3600. Compared to Aventurine's skill ceiling back in those days, for a 4000 defense Aventurine, this will be 1280, which is slightly higher, but the total cannot exceed 2560, making DHPT shield that much thicker compared to Aventurine. This will likely more than double of most attack scaling DPSs as well as your squishy support, and on top of the refresh rate via his talent Soul Dragon, you'll find a lot of combo from DHPT sustain even without using his skill points, because the Soul Dragon's action value is tied to your main DPS's action value. Now keep in mind that repeated casts of his skill will not make his Soul Dragon from the talent move faster, unlike if you were to, for example, compare with like Fu Yuan and Lingsha, but it does charge his ultimate for faster damage rotations and provides a bigger shield similar to Aventurine spamming his own skills. Now jumping to his ultimate, it is basically a erudition target AoE damage, same shield as the one from the skill, and enhances the Soul Dragon for 2 attacks to deal AoE damage as well. Now this can in fact go beyond 2 stacks, so in enemies like Ligers giving your DHPT free energy, you can gain a lot of value over here, as you can see from this facial fight. Now the damage is nothing too crazy from a raw damage perspective at around 100k against multiple targets, but compared to Aventurine's follow-up without Robin ultimate, it is going to be a lot higher for a shield sustain, even comparable to Hyacinth's raw damage. Now keep in mind that Hyacinth will generally deal more damage to sustain because she has insane synergy with Tribi, while DHPT virtually receives very little buffs since most attack scaling DPSs are supporting only the main DPS. That being said, his additional damage uses his target stat like attack, crit, damage bonus, rare spell, which you can see from this screenshot over here. The additional damage from DHPT actually does in fact crit. In an AoE environment such as Tribi, it can go from 130 to 160,000 per Soul Dragon. Now unlike Aventurine's follow-up, which is going to be considered a bounce that is a fixed damage regardless the amount of target, Soul Dragon's follow-up is an AoE, meaning it will scale with the number of targets available for you. Now moving on into DHPT's talent, yes, the dragon does in fact count as a summon for the wearer. Now this is very important, which means that both your banana 2-piece as well as your Sunday damage buff will gain the full effect of 32% crit damage and 80% damage buff respectively. For your Wanderer's 2-piece, it is not that big of a differential, and I personally wouldn't go out of my way just to farm it again for the crit damage, but if you do need more Luxaka pieces, which are the byproduct for banana, then feel free to go ahead and farm this, because Luxaka has been very universal, especially with the release of Final, right? For Sunday, the additional 50% damage is honestly really good, roughly 1.5 times compared to your elemental damage main stat. Aside from that, the frequency of your Soul Dragon will depend on how many times your DPS takes action, since each action will give 15% action value advance via his trait Sylvanity, right? Combined with the energy regeneration, you can see that multi-hit targets, for example like Fei Xiao, can give your Soul Dragon a lot of action value, so we do see a lot of synergy with DHPT running the older version 2 team comps such as my wife. The 165 fixed speed with additional action value would make him move roughly 3 times per combat, but you can expect it to be roughly a little bit faster or slower depending on how frequently your DPS moves. The shield amount is going to be halved compared to your skill and ultimate, or 75% for the lowest HP ally, because you have the additional shield from your trait Sublimity. Combine this with your skill as well as ultimates, there is rarely ever a sustained issue, especially even if you're going to just be using basic attacks on DHPD. And lastly, for his technique, TLDR, just use it, and it's going to be an instant bomb mid, exact same targeting as Saridra's technique. For the major tracers, I have no idea how to pronounce this, Empyreanity attack buff, this does not stack and it will scale at roughly 600 for a 4000 attack DHPT. For Sylvanity is a built-in vulnerability to guarantee your instant ultimate after using technique every single time, and the additional 6 energy and 15% action value for Soul Dragon allows DHPT to have a relatively fast rotation with a 135 energy ultimate on energy regeneration rope despite running just basic attacks. And lastly, Sublimity will give the lowest ally 1/4 of his skill's shield, as well as 1 minor additional damage at 40% scaling of your bondmate's attack, this scaling going up at your additional Eidolons. Then for your minor tracers, 28% attack, 22.5% defense, as well as 5 speed, generally pretty good. Skill 11 is going to be skill over ultimate over talent over your basic. Now jumping into his light cones, for the light cone comparison, DHPT's S1 is the only attack scaling preservation light cone, which is used to only scale with mainly defense and HP from back in those days, and then Texture of Memories from Herda Shop gives you a little bit of effect rest. But the Bell Pass light cone does have a pretty decent alternative for shield effect as well as damage dealt, but the only thing holding back is going to be the very low 370 base attack. If you do want to use Herda Store light cone, I just want you to give a heads up, Texture of Memories is more or less useless because it only increases the survivability of DHPT himself and not for the rest of your teammate. At this point, I'll personally just go ahead and use an off-path light cone similar to your Remembrance with Castris, where I use a Castris Bailu light cone. Just use any high base attack scaling light cone because his attack buff also scales on DHPT's attack stats. In terms of utility, his signature light cone does hold the highest value with a 36% damage buff, since they will have a summon from Soul Dragon as well as an added layer of heals from his ultimate, 10% teamwide and 20% for the lowest HP. Now this additional healing will be extremely substantial, especially if you want to use him against Anomaly Arbitration. For an S1, it is not that game changing compared to other S1s like a DPS S1 or even a Hyacinth S1, but generally still a very good signature light cone because we really don't have any good alternatives, similar to back when Castris first launched. And then for his relics, it's pretty much just going to be running the brand new 4-piece Self and Shroud of Recluse, shield effect 2-piece, as well as the additional shield effect at 4-piece on top of the 15% crit damage. Now there is one special case, and that is specifically only for Final. You can actually give DHPT a 4-piece Sacridos because Sacridos effects can actually stack on with one another, right? So if you take a look at his technique, after using DHPT's technique, it will instantly cast a skill, and then you can cast a skill again for a permanent full 2 Sacridos stacks for Final, and the crit damage is going to be higher at 36% compared to 15% from your shield set. The shield set also requires you to not lose a shield because Sacridos buff is more or less permanent for Final especially, so as long as you keep targeting Final, you will get a much higher value running 4-piece Sacridos. For other DPS, it's not that reliable because you will need to spam your skill all the time, which will run into skill point regeneration issues. For your 2-piece, any of the supports can work. Luxaka can work for any attack hyper carry or broken kill for additional crit damage as well as effect rest. Then moving on into your main stat and subsets is actually very straightforward. Attack percentage body, speed boots, attack percentage sphere, as well as energy regeneration rope, running on attack percentage as well as speed subsets. Firstly, I just want to say, why do we not have a outgoing shield main stat? There's only outgoing healing, so you know, when are we getting this, right? That aside, DHPT's build is very straightforward and there's not much room to change. He doesn't really need to deal damage at all because his scalings are all very bad, and the additional damage will be based on your bond mate, i.e. your main DPS. So for DHPT, he can focus purely on attack, speed, as well as energy regeneration. The speed and energy regeneration are your classic rotation main stats, so he can get his ultimate faster for even more damage. Now jumping into Bro's Eidolons, very good E1 as well as a very good E2, but nothing too game breaking. For his E1 is gonna be 1 skill point refund per ultimate as well as an 18% rest spend for 3 turns, which is basically almost 100% uptime. It is very strong, but I wouldn't say it is quite game changing enough unless you're using a very skill point heavy team. For example, Archer, 1 skill point in that case can be very useful if you run into a situation where you run out of skill points, especially for players that actually skipped on Sundays as one and you want to use DHPD with Sunday. So this is gonna give you a lot more flexibility in that department. If the 18% rare spend was slightly higher like Robin or Tree's 24% scaling, then it would have been better, especially since it's only gonna be applied to a single target. For his E2, I think this is honestly pretty good as well. Very similar to his E1, but nothing too game-changing compared to, like, for example, an E2 DPS or some support E1s like E1 Tribi. You are going to be getting 4 attacks instead of 2, making it almost a 100% uptime on Soul Dragon follow-up with energy regeneration. On top of that, you also gain 100% action value advance for 1 Soul Dragon attack, leaving you to 3 follow-up attacks, a little bit similar to E2 Deal using all of his 3 dragon skills immediately after the action value advance. The additional damage scaling will go from 40% to 80%, as well as double the shield from the talent, which makes it the same scaling as your skill as well as ultimate. So generally speaking, a lot of damage, a lot of comfort sustaining for an E2. Very good for the comfort, but if you don't really need it, I don't think it's going to be that game changing because it doesn't really fundamentally change the way that you're going to be playing DHPD, right? Just a lot more damage as well as more sustain. And then for E4 is just, it reduces your damage taken for your bottom by 20%, so 20% damage taken reduction. Oh my god. Insane. And then lastly, E6 is pretty much going to be a 20% vulnerability for all targets, basically permanent, 12% defense ignore, as well as an additional damage of 330% scaling, makes him a support sustained DPS all combined into one. So with regards to whether you want to pull for E1 or S1 for those vertical investments, considering that he is literally given for free, right? DHPD does feel pretty comfy enough at E0, S0, but if you do face a lot of troubles, especially with, for example, Anomaly Arbitration, S1 is going to be giving you a much better improvement in terms of your overall sustain because of the shield as well as the additional healing. If you do want a higher damage increase, then E1 is going to be there as well as the additional +1 skill point for those players who are running into skill point issues. So between both, you can kind of go for either, but generally at E0, S0, it is still going to be doable for all your endgame content unless you're talking about Anomaly Arbitration. So with that, we're just going to jump into DHPD's team comp. Honestly, DHPD can fit into almost any non-HP focused teams, almost like Bro was made perfectly for Team 2 after almost every single HP team in the game went for higher scene, right? Everybody wants higher scene, and finally now you can unlock this potential. The main focus for our team comps testing isn't to just see the clear speed, but also how comfortable it is for our team to stay alive, because that is the #1 objective for any sustain. Now, whether or not use DHPD with Sunday is honestly not that big of a deal, because Soul Dragon turns doesn't improve the overall damage as well as sustain by that much. It would be pretty nice to unlock the 80% damage buff from Sunday, but DHPD is still highly usable even if I use it with dual DPS teams such as, for example, Face Yao, or if you're going to be talking about Anexa as well as D Herda. I'll show some samples with 3 different teams as listed below to try and cover as many grounds as possible. Everything was done mostly in auto except for a couple of times here and there at E0 S1, exceptions with Tribi and Robin at E1. So the teams I'm going to be using is going to be Sunday, Servidra as well as Finon, Herda, Anexa, Tribi as well as Face Yao, Robin, and Cypher. Between these 3 teams, Finon is the most popular DPS choice to be paired with DHPD, especially with Servidra and Sunday, as this team synergizes with one another very well. Aside from Servidra and Sunday's natural synergy with Finon for maximum damage amplification as well as core flame generation, DHPD's Dragon actually stays on field and remains in action bar because it is not considered a Mimo sprite, giving Finon his much needed sustain for players finding difficulty surviving, especially for your extreme difficulty content such as Anomaly Arbitration. I can say that Finon with or without DHPD in AA Ligas is literally night and day, because I'm pretty sure no one's ever cleared normally Ligas before you activate E2 Finon. So this time we actually managed to get it clear, so I do look forward for his arrival for players who are still trying to clear without a Castrins or higher scene team. Now that being said, for players who are already running a sustainless Finon team comfortably, especially with strong vertical investments like E2 Finon, then adding in DHPD would not really improve your run by that much, or maybe sometimes even slow down your run, because his damage utility is often lower than that of an actual support compared to, for example, like Robin, Tribi, Sparkle, or even potentially when Cyrene comes out in the future. That ultimately will depend on player's choice. Do you want as much damage as possible, or do you want the added layer of sustain for Finon? Now, for the other team, Anexa, Herda, and Tribi, this has always been a very solid pick ever since this team has basically established with Anexa, and with Cyrene coming out by 3.7 to potentially replace Tribi on the Caster's team, Tribi can at least find a new home with our OG version 3.0 DPS, Herda. Now, Herda has been a very strong pick, especially into erudition-based content, but she lacked that proper sustain slot with her options being either Gallagher or Lingsha back then, both having their own issues, such as, for example, skill point economy issues, lack of utility as a break focus sustain, or simply not having enough sustain. DHPD will elevate that by giving us a much better synergy with his basic spam, extremely thick shields, attack buffs, and Ultimate and Soul Dragon both having an AoE target, which will allow us to have perfect synergy with Herda, Tribi, as well as Anexa. On a similar note, Anexa main DPS without Herda is also really strong DHPD, running Sunday with either Tribi, Saridra, or Robin. Anexa gets the Soul Dragon, which gives a lot of value from Sunday's action value advance to basically guarantee full skill point positivity as well as skill uptime for DHPD, and Sunday does give Anexa the 80% damage buff. Now, the last team is gonna be my favorite team of all time, HSR, Fei Xiao. Fei Xiao honestly has extremely good synergy with DHPD due to the Soul Dragon attacks counting as follow-up attacks, and Fei Xiao's own kit greatly improving Soul Dragon's action value and DHPD's energy because each of Fei Xiao's follow-up attacks counts as an attack for DHPD. Combining this with Cypher and Robin, this is most likely gonna be Fei Xiao's best in slot team, overthrowing Aventurine's previous position as a sustain since his shields are much higher. In terms of stack generation, both DHPD and Aventurine will depend on the environment to see who is better. If the enemies have a very high attack frequency as well as AoE hits, then Aventurine's follow-up is going to be a lot faster, whereas if you are going to be up against slower enemies with single target environments, then DHPD shield is going to be a lot more comfortable. From a pure sustain standpoint, DHPD does feel more comfortable because the max shield scaling is a lot higher, and with Robin specifically, you also gain a bigger shield because Robin's attack buff does improve DHPD's shield scaling, unlike Aventurine which used to scale off of defense. Above all, every single one of these teams has zero issues sustaining on full auto whatsoever, so if you're concerned with a free unit sustain capabilities, rest assured DHPD will definitely make your lives a lot easier for those struggling with your older sustains, especially for example if you're running Hui Hui, Luo Cha, and all that kind of stuff. We're finally going to talk on our last topic, and that is going to be our endgame performance, but just a little bit of heads up, I'm also going to be adding a specific segment for anomaly arbitration going forward from this early access all the way in the future. I will be using Finon as the benchmark since Finon does have the best performance as of now with Sunday and Saridra. To see the video of DHPD, I basically compared Finon's current clears with both the old triple support and the brand new DHPD with the inclusion. For us to be a little bit more relatable, I'm going to be running RMC as our triple support, and the results can be seen over here. For Memory of Chaos against Judge of Oblivion, DHPD actually allowed an even faster clear on full auto. Granted, the manual play of RMC would have probably have a higher performance ceiling, so probably going to be clearing at roughly the same pace, if not maybe a little bit faster. Now, the Judge of Oblivion's mechanics does favor significantly for DHPD because shields allows us for getting a lot of 1000 bar damage, and Judge of Oblivion does have the damage reduction. If you want to understand this boss a little bit more, feel free to check out this early access video for Judge over here. But aside from that, this boss is made perfectly for DHPD, so I'm not too surprised why DHPD is going to be doing a lot better than a triple support, on top of making it a lot more comfortable for an entire team in Finon to survive the endgame. In terms of pure fiction, generally speaking, Finon's strong suit has never been in this endgame, and it has nothing to do with his sustain, but just the way that Finon dealt damage was just much slower compared to teams with, for example, Tribi and Hyacinth. That being said, DHPD does allow for an even faster clear than RMC despite being a sustain. Soul Dragon's erudition targeting greatly improved our mob rotations, which allow our Finon's enhanced skill to hit with even more value compared to running an RMC. At this particular point, I also do want to point out that because we are going to be in a situation where the Soul Dragon is always going to be up, we are going to be seeing a lot more comfortable downtime during Finon's ultimate as compared to before you're going to be running your DHPD. So for example, if you are going to be running a sustainless team and you ran out of Finon's ultimate, especially for longer drawn out content like for example pure fiction, there is a potential probability that your team might actually die, but with DHPD this is basically a risk-free team going forward. And then lastly, for Epoch Shadows, it is around the same clear speed between both. Ultimately, it's going to be a mechanics check on Cocolia because energy regeneration for this Epoch Shadows is completely useless on Finon since your entire team is not even going to be in stage and you're going to be getting 100% uptime on Finon's ultimate anyways, so not too much of a difference to be talked about over here. So in conclusion, DHPD being a sustain unironically does not make Final clear in the 3 endgames slower than triple supports, especially on full auto. But that being said, if RMC was done using a manual play, or if a better slot 4 like Tribi, Sparkle, Robin, or even maybe Cyrene gets released in the future, we will have to see if the additional effective HP from DHPD is going to be better compared to a better slot 4 for the true blue highest damage amplification for Final's endgame content. For all the other DPSs, kindly stay tuned for the future live server content. Now, I do want to add on this one last segment, and that is going to be dedicated to anomaly arbitration going forward. I will keep this brief because I've played so many anomaly arbitration games in the past 1 week, and honestly, I'm just a little bit tired of anomaly arbitration. But for this anomaly arbitration, because we have quite a couple of sentiments in my community, how does DHPD work in this kind of really sustained check content, right? I would say that for any of the endgame content, anomaly arbitration has the highest sustained check that we've ever seen in HSR. So how does DHPD pair, especially if you want to compare them highest seen or your older version 1 and version 2 sustains? So as of the Ligus anomaly arbitration, the environment for this AA is still heavily favorable for Castris and her HP scaling friends due to your percentage max HP loss as well as the energy reduction. This entire gimmick is just perfect for these HP scaling DPS. For any other DPS, it is just not really going to care about the HP loss that much, which means it's just going to give you a little bit less synergy. Aside from that, you are also going to be receiving a lot of damage. If you're not going to be using higher scene, no other sustain, honestly, we can actually keep up with this version 3. So now that we do have DHPD, the shielding amount is going to be at a much more comparable basis. As such, for players who can already clear anomaly arbitration running your Castris, Evernight, Hyacinth, Tribi, RMC, all these kind of teams, you probably won't see any changes in your anomaly arbitration setup because DHPD, frankly speaking, is not built for Castris anyways. Rather, DHPD's purpose is to open up alternatives for other players that do want to run other DPSs, for example, like Final. That being said, E0 S1 Venom was actually able to sustain his way through a 1-star clear running DHPD at full E0 S1, which personally I felt this was an incredible feat because before the release of DHPD, not a single E0 final has ever cleared anomaly arbitration except for E2 S1 finals and above. Now, the biggest convert was shown when DHPD shield allowed for the rest of Final's team to sustain and stay alive on the field while waiting for Final to get his charge back up. Before DHPD, this was simply impossible, so now that we do have this added into the mix, Final can finally in fact clear anomaly arbitration. Granted, it is still gonna be a lot slower compared to the Castris. Now, unfortunately, I tried to run this same setup with an Nexa Hyper Carry, but the damage was unfortunately not enough because the Wave 1 Lion spawns way too many of those little bats unless you can time your Nexa freezes enough to the point where the Lion just summons the bat maybe at most twice, then you can just clear this Wave 1 as fast as possible. When it actually came to Ligus, it's actually not that difficult. Other DPSs like Archer and Aglaya could see some play, but we'll leave that for the live server for now. As of right now, DHPD's sustain level is definitely on par for a version 3 sustain, and you will instantly feel the difference compared to sustains like Luocha, Gallagher, Huo, and Fuxuan, especially against anomaly arbitration. So whether or not you guys clear with him, please feel free to try out for yourselves in the live server. I just want to say his sustain is comparable to Hyacinth, but Hyacinth as a whole, HP damage DPS as a whole like Castris is just way more synergistic for Ligus. And with that, we have come to the end of DHPT's early access review. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Word of the day is going to be wholly overworking for me and my editor. Join Twitch, join YouTube, join Discord, join Twitter, join our page for all of our anime reviews. Use code for 10% off gamers out. All the best. We're going to see you guys next time. Take care. Holy.